Welcome back to Cultivate Talk. When we think about sports, we often think about competition, the games, the players, the stats. But sports are also communication. They are the stories we tell about who we are, what we value, and how we show up in moments of change. Today's episode explores that intersection, where sports meets activism through the lens of the WNBA. In this episode, I'm joined by Jakki Padilla, a scholar whose research examines how the WNBA, and especially the Atlanta Dream during the 2020 and 2021 season, became a powerful example of collective voice and social change. We talk about the role of communication in athlete activism, the influence of power and intersectionality, and how Black women athletes have reshaped what leadership looks like, both on and off the court. Jakki also helps us unpack the dynamics between activism, public relations, and the cultural impact of the league during one of the most pivotal moments in recent history. Whether you're a sports fan, a communicator, or just curious about how voices spark change, this conversation offers a reminder that activism isn't just about what happens on the court. It's about how stories, identities, and courage come together to shape culture. I am here with Jakki Padilla, a recent master's graduate from the University of Alaska Fairbanks Troth Yeehaw in professional communication. Her research is based off of the documentary Power of the Dream, and Jakki is specifically interested in public relations and how the WNBA used their platform to initiate change. Hi, Jakki. How are you doing today?
Hello, Emily. I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm really grateful to be here and excited.
I am super grateful that you are here, and I'm super excited to talk to you about your research. And I kind of just want to start at the beginning. So, can you tell us a little bit about how you came to study the WNBA and specifically WNBA and activism? Like, what drew you to this particular interest?
What drew me to the WNBA was I grew up playing basketball, so I've always been interested in it, always been a fan as I stopped playing. Specifically, I've always liked college basketball, but as the WNBA started to become more mainstream and more televised, I started following it a little more frequently. Um, so when I took some of my graduate classes, I had to write a paper, and recently the Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese in college basketball incident happened. So I was like, I want to write about that because that was very controversial and it was viewed at differently with the whole "you can't see me" gesture.
Right.
Um, so that's where it started. And my professors highly encouraged me to kind of stick with sports communication, being that that was kind of what I knew and what I was passionate about. So that was the path I took forward, and I was just kind of bouncing ideas around. I had recently watched the documentary Power of the Dream, and I thought it was very impactful and left a profounding impact on me because I don't feel like it's talked about or known that the WNBA is like they advocate for social justice. Like that is in their DNA. It is like one of the pillars of who they are, who those women are, and it's not really recognized. And I think that that's important to inform other people that what they're doing could be like the groundwork and foundation for other individuals in public relations.
Absolutely. I love that origin story. I think it's great. I think of all the people I've interviewed for this podcast so far, I probably have the most in sports communication, which is awesome because I think if I didn't have the focuses that I did, mine would have been sports communication. So I just find this stuff incredibly interesting and relevant to the current landscape of our society and sports fans in general. So I know you alluded to this a moment ago, but your thesis focuses on the Atlanta Dream during the 2020-2021 season. For listeners who might not know the backstory, can you give us a quick overview of what was happening in the league and why this moment mattered?
Of course. So there is a footnote there I will point out. So the WNBA typically runs from May to September. So I put 2021 because the incidences and their activism was going into 2021, not it didn't just occur in 2020. So as we all know, 2020, I'm sure we all have our own stories of COVID, but not only were we dealing with it on a personal level, but athletes were dealing with it, and specifically the WNBA was dealing with it. The WNBA players do not make a lot of money, unfortunately, and they just negotiated like a big contract deal to get better benefits, get paid more, and then COVID happened. So players were kind of confused as to what their season was going to look like and if they were getting paid, because their paycheck was relied on by their families and loved ones. So they ended up coming up with a deal to be in a bubble in Florida, and have their season in Florida. So all 144 players, all of the coaches and staff were in this bubble. So they were not allowed to leave. And it was kind of like their own community. And I really think that this propelled the activism because they were all together, all on the same page, for the whole 2020 season. And during 2020 was also an election year, um, which caused more controversy because the Atlanta Dream specifically had an owner, Kelly Loeffler, who was appointed a seat in the Senate for the state of Georgia. She was a white woman, and as soon as she was appointed that seat, she started going on air and publicly advocating for anti Black Lives Matter movements, anti LGBT rights, and then also anti abortion, which was very controversial, being that the WNBA is over 60% Black women, as well as they have a large population of the LGBT community. So the players on Kelly Loeffler's team were not happy with her, and I just thought it was so fascinating that they took an opposite spin of what most of the media does. So their campaign and what they collaborated to do was to not say her name, which was also interesting because they dedicated their whole season to the Say Her Name campaign for Breonna Taylor, because also going on in 2020 was the racial injustice that the world was seeing, and that affected a lot of the players as Black women. So some of the players even decided to sit out the season and continue their social justice activism and take the season off. But players who did decide to play, they felt like they needed to dedicate the season and make it larger than who they were, because they understood, being that all of this was going on simultaneously, COVID is going on. So everyone is at home because we're quarantined. So they knew people were going to watch. So they had to make an impact. So they put Breonna Taylor's name on the back of all their jerseys. They put Black Lives Matter on the basketball court. And that was what they dedicated their season to. And Kelly Loeffler, the owner of the Atlanta Dream, tried to get them to take it off, and they wouldn't take it away. So as it's an election year, the WNBA was like, okay, we're not going to say her name. We're not going to pay her any mind. We're going to see who she's running against. They did their own research, thorough research, and they found another candidate by the name of Reverend Raphael Warnock. They did some research on him. They found that he was a reverend in the state of Georgia. He was a Black man, and he kind of aligned with the WNBA's views. He wanted racial justice. He was for women's rights as well as LGBT rights. So they set up a meeting with Reverend Raphael Warnock, and that was the route that they decided to take. Next thing you know, they're all wearing T-shirts in their tunnel walks to games that say "Vote Warnock," and they kind of spread his name out, and his polls went up through the roof. And they continued to advocate for him once the season even ended on their social media platforms. And then Reverend Raphael Warnock ended up winning that Senate seat in a runoff election in 2021. And it's just incredible what they did and the change that they made, because Reverend Raphael Warnock was the first Black senator in the state of Georgia.
Yeah, a truly amazing story. And for those who are listening and might not know, can you plug where they're able to find the documentary?
Of course, the documentary is currently streaming on Amazon Prime.
Good to know. Awesome. So, like I mentioned at the beginning of this, I love your research and I am super excited to be with you today to talk about it. But one thing is you draw on Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality to explore the experiences of Black women athletes. Can you break down what intersectionality means in this context and why it's so important to your study?
Intersectionality in this study kind of just relates to the intersecting identities, specifically the marginalized identities that the WNBA players individually hold. So they're all, majority of them identify as women, And then also majority of them, like I said before, over 60% of them are Black women, and a majority of them also identify with the LGBT community. So all of those intersectionalities are coming together um, to just kind of create strife for them in their lives and what they're trying to do. They're kind of not looked at or taken seriously in the league of professional sports overall. Because I'm sure a lot of you all, unfortunately, maybe even watching this, have never heard of the documentary. And that's just the unfortunate part. But my goal is to just kind of put that out there and let other individuals know. Um, and as I was writing this, I did have a moment of imposter syndrome as a white appearing woman. And I did a lot of research on Black women and Black women's history and just tried to continuously cite my sources. And Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, I think, has done amazing work. So thank you, Dr. Crenshaw, for all of your hard work. There was a quote I found by Susan Stanford Friedman in like the 1990s. She also was a white appearing woman, and she frequently wrote about racial injustice. And her quote was, "I cannot accept the notion that the racial privilege of my whiteness should enforce my silence about race and ethnicity. Yet I ask you to hear me out." And that quote just stuck with me profoundly. And once I read that, I was like, okay, I can use my voice and my white appearingness to also advocate for racial justice, because that is a very important topic to me overall.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a really good segue to my next question is you do bring in theories of power and whiteness. How do these concepts help us understand the dynamics at play in professional sports and specifically the WNBA?
So I would say power in and of itself um, is just a social construct. But if we look at it historically, who typically holds position of quote, quote, power? It's usually white men. So you look at the WNBA comprised mostly of Black women. You look at the
Yeah.
people who have those ownership seats or even the coaching staff, a lot of times it is white individuals. I can't tell you the exact rate of white coaches versus Black coaches in the WNBA, but I know for ownership, just looking specifically at the Atlanta Dream during this documentary in 2020, ownership was white. They were coached by a white appearing woman. And then after that season, Kelly Loeffler resigned from her seat of ownership, and they got a new ownership with a former player, Renee Montgomery, who is a Black woman who is now an owner of the Atlanta Dream. And I think that is a beautiful story. So just kind of regaining that power there. And then
Right.
the whiteness theory comes into play, just how whiteness is kind of like the standard of society in America, like Western ideologies. So just trying to challenge those theories, and this documentary definitely did that. And I think just kind of continuously trying to challenge them and prove them wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. That is great. So, athlete activism isn't new, but the WNBA's activism during that season felt especially powerful. What sets this moment apart?
I think what sets this moment apart is just the overall context of the whole scenario, because it's kind of like all of the pieces were kind of unfortunately there. Because if they weren't in a bubble, who's to say that would have happened? What if COVID never happened? Would this have happened? When I was doing my thesis defense, after I passed and everything, I was just chatting with my committee, and one of my professors had asked me, "Do you think this could can be recreated?" And I thought about it, and I was like, "I don't think so." I'm like, I think everything unfortunately was the stage was set, this opportunity was presented to them, and the WNBA players decided to utilize their platform for the greater good, not just for their own themselves. They were very selfless.
Yeah, it absolutely seems like a unique moment where everything had to play out the way that it did in order for this to happen. And like you just said, if one thing was misplaced or one thing didn't happen, it's really hard to think that such action would have been taken in this way. So that's kind of what makes it such a unique and fascinating and inspiring story. So, you've studied how public reaction to activism can range from support to backlash. What patterns did you notice in the WNBA's case?
The WNBA stayed consistent the entire time, and they always did like thorough research. So when they decided to put Breonna Taylor's name on the back of their jerseys, they didn't just do that. They had a talk with Breonna Taylor's mother, like a Zoom meeting, because of course it was COVID. They were in a bubble, and they got
Right.
her blessing to do that. And I thought that was a very like intimate and profound moment because they could have probably just done it, but they wanted it to be intentional. They were very intentional in everything that they did. And the pushback, I feel like the documentary only showed was from Kelly Loeffler's side with her protesting, and she wrote a letter to the WNBA commissioner saying that they can't do that. The league tried to find them, but they weren't like that was old news because that happened in 2016 because the WNBA's activism has been going on for a lot longer than people are aware of. And they kind of mention that in the documentary that the WNBA was built on activism and social justice because of
Right.
what the WNBA is and who they are.
Yeah. That's awesome. And that's a really good educational point too for people who might not know that is the fact that the WNBA was built on on that. But I don't necessarily want to spoil the documentary for anyone anymore. So we'll just stop there. But kind of keeping along the lines of activism, what does the WNBA's activism teach us about the role of women and especially Black women in shaping public discourse and social change?
Mm. I would say just staying persistent, but also being intentional. They were very intentional, like I mentioned, with everything that they did. In the documentary, they called them scouting reports. If you are familiar with any type of sport, you know a scouting report is kind of getting information on the other team, another player, kind of like a resume in a sense that everybody can, that's probably a good metaphor for it. So they were doing a good scouting report on on everything that they were doing. They talked to Breonna Taylor's mother. They talked to Reverend Raphael Warnock before they started wearing the shirts. And they kind of held regular meetings and regular visuals for some of the incidences that were continuing of racial injustice through the summer of 2020.
Yes. And I think it's a really interesting topic when it comes up in all sports, but like this role of activism and sports, because sports fans often think of games as entertainment. How does activism shift our understanding of what sports are and what they do in society?
I think understanding that sports are a form of entertainment and like an escape from reality, but also at the end of the day, like we're all human. And the WNBA players, when they take off their uniform, they are women. They are Black women. They are white women. They are gay women. And that's truly who they are at the end of their day. And I think people holistically should look at that and treat people with respect and kindness. Because when I leave work, I take off my work hat. Not that I wear a hat at work, but like my imaginary hat, and I'm sure a lot of us do, because I'm my own person when I go home and I put on my other hat. So I think just understanding like the layers to people, and they are not just entertainers. They are humans. They have a voice, and their opinions matter.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think the WNBA's activism has changed how other leagues like the NFL, the NBA, and the NCAA approach athlete voices and political?
That's interesting that you only mentioned men's leagues, um, because I don't really think, if I'm being honest, I don't really follow a lot of men's sports. I might be biased in that regard, but to my knowledge, I don't believe the NBA is as activism oriented as the WNBA is, and that's interesting because the WNBA is kind of
Yeah.
like the sister to the NBA. So that is very an interesting thought in and of itself. Um, and I'm not sure what the NFL is doing, and I know the NCAA doesn't get too political. They kind of stick to their
Right.
NCAA rules overall. But I do know that the National Women's Soccer League has done a little bit of activism. And I don't know if anybody listens to the Sue Bird, Megan Rapinoe podcast, but they often talk about activism because Megan Rapinoe, soccer, Sue Bird, basketball, and how when the women's soccer league does anything. So they were fighting for more pay, and they ended up getting more
Right.
pay, and it was all over the news and the media. And then when the WNBA does their activism, it's not. It doesn't seem like it's in the media. Um, and Sue Bird and Megan Rapinoe touch on that. And Megan Rapinoe's response was, "It's because if you look at the demographic of the players." And I think that in of itself is very telling and unfortunate, that what's in the media is being pushed is you have to, that goes back to the whiteness theory, and that's unfortunate, um, with this world that we live in.
Right. And you mentioned this a few times, but the WNBA was built with a different foundation than these other leagues, especially these men oriented leagues with these players like the NFL and the NBA. And so I can only imagine, I mean, this is just me like talking out, like thinking out loud and probably just hypothesizing, but I imagine that some influence from a league that was built on activism and kind of with these values at least inspired or influenced the other leagues that exist in our sports world, whether that be a little bit or a lot, especially when we think about the activism that these other professional leagues have taken on. I'm not sure it's been as well articulated in some instances as what the WNBA has displayed. So I'm just going to tell myself that there's been that inspiration, there's been that influence with these other leagues because, it seems as if, a league that has had success with it would pave that way for other leagues.
There has been. So in 2016, the Minnesota Lynx, um, they were advocating for George Floyd. They weren't standing for the national anthem. They weren't coming out of the locker room for the national anthem. This, mind you, their league is in the summer, so this happened during the summer.
Right.
Their
Yeah.
on staff security guards walked out of the game, because the players were not coming out for the national anthem. They took offense to that. And I think it was like the commissioner of like the police department in that town. He literally said, they should just shut up and dribble, which is crazy. And then fast forward a few months later, and Colin Kaepernick is kneeling for the national anthem on national TV, and all of the backlash that he received publicly because more individuals watch the NFL compared to the WNBA, specifically during 2016.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So it's really fascinating to think about how those two go hand in hand. So you mentioned reflexivity as a scholar. How has your own identity or experience shaped the way you approach this research?
Can you elaborate maybe a little more on that question, please? I feel a little
Yeah, so
stumped.
no, it's totally fine. So, like your own identity or experience shaped the way you approach this research. I know you mentioned in the beginning that you played basketball and the significance and importance of the documentary. But is there anything else about your identity that perhaps you see in this story in some way that has inspired you further or has changed your approach to this research compared to someone else who perhaps doesn't identify in the same way?
I think just even taking the identity aspect out of it, just looking at it like holistically, like because the WNBA is not all made up of the same race. There was 144 women, yet they all banded together for the greater good. Because Sue Bird in the documentary, she was a player at the time. She's a white woman, and she admits that. And she took on a lot. She said that it was kind of like a dance, she called it, where she knew when she needed to take action, but also when she needed to step back, to let Black women take charge and take center
Mhm.
stage for this. So I think just not making it about yourself, especially as a white woman, like this is somebody else's story that I am sharing. And I'm very thankful for that. I'm thankful for the players for sharing their story. I'm thankful for Kim Porter for creating this documentary, and for sharing this story so I can go on to continue to share this story, within the discipline of communications.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And what has been the most surprising or impactful insight you've gained from studying the WNBA and activism?
Just how well they work together for the greater good. And I think like it just has a lot to do. I don't know if it's they don't have as many egos as men's leagues, but just to see them cohesively, continuously all come together for the greater good and have each other's back. Because they talk about that, how it's a sisterhood. They're bonding. They spend half of the year together, playing together, eating together, practicing together. So I think overall, just like the camaraderie that is consistent, even though you might not look like your teammate, but they still are trying their best to understand and to support what their teammate believes in, because they know themselves that it's not fair for racial injustice to happen to an innocent black man or black woman.
Right. And when we think about like the culture of sports, and when it comes to these male dominated leagues like the NFL and the NBA, you mentioned egos, which is what made me think of this. There, beyond egos, there's other, toxic elements in terms of like the masculinity that's expected, the competitiveness, how toxic fans can be. And it's interesting to think that the WNBA environment might, and with women's leagues in general, might not have all of these elements, and we can still appreciate and enjoy the sport, but it's like through an entirely different lens than what the entire sports world has created with men dominated leagues. So I think that's like a really interesting perspective in terms of what these leagues are able to accomplish and what they're able to advocate for and what they're able to stand for. And one kind of has perhaps less distraction in terms of the world of competitiveness and masculinity and so on. And we are able to see that differently compared to when these like male driven leagues activate or advocate for something and they practice activism.
And it could be because like more people tune in to the NBA, the NFL, and that's not what the media wants to put out. That's not on their agenda.
Right.
So that's probably why they get more pushback or they don't do it as well. I don't even think it's probably as deep as the ego. It's probably because they get pushback from the media, from like their platforms that they have contracts with, and that's
Yeah.
very unfortunate. And I think social media, that's where the beauty of social media comes in, because players can advocate freely on social media. But then again, if you make millions of dollars, um, I feel like your hands are probably tied in what you can and cannot say from your public relations manager for your own image. And that's kind of unfortunate. Um, so it would be good to see more of that from the men's side, individually and as teams and organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally get that. And my final question for you, Jakki, is if you could give one takeaway to athletes, fans, or listeners about communication and activism, what would it be?
Don't be afraid. I would say don't be afraid, because you're probably not the only one who wants to do that if you are the one activating. And if you see athletes activating, I think listen to them and don't just view them as entertainers, as athletes. Maybe take them seriously and do some self reflection of why you feel so strongly that they should shut up and dribble. Like, where is that coming from? Is it because you don't take women seriously? You don't take women's sports seriously? Is it because they're black women? That's very layered. It goes back to intersectionality and very deep. So I would say just listen to what athletes have to say, because their voices matter just as much as everyone else's.
Well said. I love that so much. Thank you so much for being with me today and talking about your work. I'm super excited to see where this research takes you and all the amazing work you're going to do in your future.
Thank you, Emily. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your time and thank you for the podcast.
Thank you. What I love about my conversation with Jakki is how clearly it shows that communication is never neutral, it's action. Whether on a court, in a press room, or within a community, the words we choose and the platforms we use can create real change. The WNBA's story is one of collective voice, a story about what happens when people come together to speak out, to push for something better, and to show that activism and professionalism can coexist. It's also a reminder that courage and communication often go hand in hand. If today's episode got you thinking about the stories you follow, the teams you cheer for, or the issues you care about, I hope it inspires you to pay closer attention to the messages behind the moments. Because what we see on the surface, the wins, the games, the headlines, is often just the beginning of a much deeper conversation. Thank you so much for tuning in to Cultivate Talk. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please follow the show wherever you listen to podcasts. Until next time, keep cultivating connection, one conversation at a time.